Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders, viewable on Oppenheim TV and YouTube. Today, we're chatting with the magnificent team, or members of the magnificent team over at Art Bridges, including Anne Kraybill, the Chief Executive Officer, Brittany Vernon, Director of Engagement, Awards, and Impact, and Ashley Holland, Curator and Director of Curatorial Initiatives. And it's just great to have you all here. I'm so appreciative. Art Bridges is an organization that's near and dear to my heart. I was around during the founding and during the recruitment of its inaugural leadership, and Anne, you were part of that. So it's great to see you now leading the organization, and talk a little bit about Crystal Bridges, Art Bridges, that relationship, the whole concept behind Alice's idea of what Art Bridges should be and the contribution it should make to the field of museums.
Sure, I'm happy to, and thanks for having us here. So, as you are probably very familiar, and I'm sure a lot of the viewers out there are familiar, Alice created Crystal Bridges in Bentonville, Arkansas, which is her hometown. And there was a lot of skepticism from major metros, from the East Coast, from the West Coast, about whether or not anybody would even, value having an art museum in the middle of the country. But based on her experience growing up, not having access to art, and understanding just the real impact it had upon her later in life as an adult, but also memories of painting watercolors with her mother, she felt like, I'm going to build this institution in my hometown where the nearest museum is Tulsa, 2 hours away. And then after that, you're looking at Casey and Little Rock, 3.5 hours away. And I just know that people are going to love it. And now what? 8 million visitors later, it is a beloved institution for a city that has a population of about 50,000. So it's a pretty amazing story. But she created Crystal Bridges also with pretty minimal storage. And she did that because she just doesn't believe that art can exist without a viewer. And I think that that's, a really important thought, that art is a public good. It doesn't do anybody any good if it's sitting in storage.
So access is really important, right? If it's sitting in storage, you don't have access. It's in some sort of a closed, dark box, right?
Yeah, and I mean, in her mind, it just doesn't even exist, right? So if it's in a closed, dark box and nobody can, it comes to life when it has that viewer to interact with it. So access is key, paramount to everything that she does. And this planted the seed for, couldn't we then work with institutions who have lots of artworks in storage, or institutions who don't have lots of gallery space? Because I will tell you, there are some institutions that are very, very small that have gems of collections that we found. And could we help give logistical and financial support to get this art out of storage and kind of redistribute it across the country, particularly with institutions maybe that had, their heyday. I was at the Westmoreland Museum of American Art, and coal fed that community back in the day. And then the Wichita Art Museum and newspapers fed that museum back in the day. But their acquisition funds really left once the economy shifted. So couldn't we help to redistribute art to those institutions who just don't have acquisition funds and are really beholden to local collecting tastes, and therefore, don't necessarily have the opportunity to have a more inclusive and diverse story of American art? And so we've done that. We have over 260 partners, and we get art out of storage. But beyond just getting the art out of storage and sort of parachuting it in, we do believe that the art should be activated, and activated with community. And so both Ashley and Brittany are like the perfect people to talk about that work that we do.
Let's talk about who gets to tell the stories and who gets access to those stories that are being told. Brittany, let's talk about the access piece. You are this person who is focused on engagement. Who gets engaged? Who are you targeting? How do you view engagement?
Yeah, I think that, we're really relying on our museum partners across the country to know their communities best. So one of the first questions we ask them is who's coming to your museum and who isn't. And we really want to focus our efforts on who isn't coming currently to those museums.
You said something fabulous. Let's not always be going back to the people who are already insiders. That's hard to do, isn't it? I mean, it's hard. What are the impediments? The people who aren't engaging, talk a little bit, unpack that. How do you how do you understand those audiences who are not engaged? You might not even have data on them. The organizations might not have data on them. How do you figure out what to do next?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we do is actually help them collect that data on who is and who isn't coming, and the demographics of their visitors through an exit survey that is a standardized survey that about a third-ish of our partners employ to understand, those dynamics. And based on the data that they gather, we can understand, okay, this certain, demographic isn't, or this age group isn't coming to your museum. Why don't we help you start to have conversations with those people to figure out what they want and need from you so that we can design programs that are actually meeting needs and are not just what the museum wants to do or what they always do. So we're encouraging our partners to be in conversation with their communities. We fund community advisory groups and committees and other kinds of feedback gathering mechanisms for community members. And we're also funding innovative programs and innovative in-gallery experiences that would help somebody who maybe isn't comfortable in museums or doesn't feel represented there feel comfortable there and feel represented there and feel like there's something there that they can do and engage with that the art just may be the background for them to experience something else, a different motivation for why they might come.
Ashley, I have a question for you, because very often curators are accused of being too much talking to the other experts, right? Curators are experts, right? Talking to other experts is kind of great. But now you're talking to people that Ashley has identified with in partnership with their museums who are not experts, who might have never even come into a museum. How do you curate for that kind of accessibility, that kind of engagement?
Yeah, I think it's about what your motivation is and what your philosophy of the purpose of art is. And for me, the purpose of art is to be seen by people within museum spaces. Artists create for their communities and for larger communities. And without that visitor, the artwork is really, existing for scholars to argue about, but that's not having a larger impact. And so ultimately, what I'm thinking about is what is going to serve the community through artistic forms, and how are they going to benefit from having access to this art? Being able to see yourself in a museum is transformative. Being able to learn about other communities and other cultures in a museum has a real impact on communities and results in an increase in empathy for people. These are things that are really important. And so as a curator, I always say that my first concern is the community, and the artwork is really how I'm going to reach that community.
That's superb. So when you're talking about engagement, when you're talking about art, you're talking also about a civil society dialogue, right? And when you think about Art Bridges, do you think of Art Bridges as an arts organization, a civil society organization, a peacemaking, community building organization? How do you identify Art Bridges as an institution, its purpose in the greater scheme of things?
I mean, I think, fundamentally, we are trying to transform the field. So we are really trying to move museums from just the lip service of we serve our communities to actually behavioral change. And so some of the things that we're looking at is how can we improve access to art by updating loan agreements, for instance. So, changing museum standards so that there's no longer the gatekeepers of 70 degrees and 50% humidity as the rule for art sharing. So fundamental things like that, to how it is that we're actually working with and engaging communities, or how those institutions are working with and engaging communities. And that, takes time, but Brittany's team does such an amazing job of helping to foster and broker those relationships so that things are developed in collaboration with community rather than for.
So that's really interesting. You're getting down into the weeds. I love the example, right? Very often these loan agreements have sort of a template. It's applied to everything. Not every object is so sensitive. And what you're saying is let's get into the weeds and let's see if this is really a necessity, or is it just an impediment, right?
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot that's tied to just carbon footprint with that as well. So we're working around how to just be more, in our industry, shipping, creating, all of those things are, taking resources. And so how can we be as efficient as possible with that and accessible as possible with that? So getting people to invest in reusable crates, as we have done, being able to update those loan agreements so that those HVAC systems don't have to work overtime to, achieve standards that are just impossible to achieve. And then how can we create networks or ecosystems of art sharing so that those shipping costs can be reduced?
I like the example of reusable crates, right? Because you've got an environmental impact, you've got a labor impact, you've got a resource impact, and plus reusable crates means that you're thinking about the entire life cycle of when an artwork comes into an environment and exits the environment. So you're actually thinking about this differently. It's less transactional. And in those transactions, a lot of waste occurs. And I see you nodding, Ashley. You've seen the piles of wood, and other stuff that just get discarded at the end of the day. So in terms of that logistical piece, do you have particular experts within either Art Bridges or that come in on a subcontractual basis or that are contributed by other organizations to help you conceive of how this, because most museums and most arts organizations aren't logistical experts. Is that an in-house thing, Anne, or do you bring people from the outside to look at your logistics workflows?
Both. So we have an incredible exhibitions department and a fleet of registrars that help with all of those logistics. We've invested in reusable crates ourselves and are testing those out, and hopefully can invest even more and kind of keep a rotation of them. But then we've also partnered with an organization called Key Futures, and they're based in Europe, but they're really around how to reduce, carbon footprint, which we found is very much tied to access. So how do we create the most accessible loans possible? All of these things are related. And so they did a training with us so that we actually could walk the talk and update our own loan agreements, because we found that we were using old standards as well. And then we're going to be rolling this out to our partners as professional development opportunities for them.
I love the carbon footprint point, because I don't want this to get lost. Yes, it hits carbon and climate and all this other stuff, but carbon footprint is basically the expenditure of energy, which is costly, the expenditure of labor, which is costly, the expenditure of resource, which is costly. And what you're talking about basically is reducing costs, right? Very practical. Reducing costs, reducing impact, making things easier, real practical stuff, right?
Absolutely. I mean, look at our founder.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. I want to hit another point which you all have made in different ways. As I've gone through various museums all across the country, you go into the storage areas and you see the hierarchy of what is defined with art as art. So previously, art was not defined as being created by anything but males, right? So women artists were frequently in those if they were collected at all, they were frequently in the back in the storage areas, right? It was also the same for art that was created by people of different ethnic groups or different nationalities or different traditions, right? And then all of a sudden, somebody discovers it, and there's this fabulous exhibit, and you find that graffiti artists are finally recognized as real artists, right? Because graffiti was marginalized, it wasn't real art. What you're doing, isn't it to systematically explore those collections and query what art actually is, who an artist is, and how do you expose people in general to that process? Isn't that part of the process, Brittany? When you talk about engagement, you're talking about an exploration of things that have not yet been explored.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I think it speaks to what Ashley was saying, is seeing different perspectives represented. Those perspectives may be representing who you are, and feeling that sense of empowerment and ownership over being in a space where you see cultural production that's made by somebody that looks like you, or in mediums that you might also do that you never thought were art, but now you're seeing them in a museum, and it automatically kind of gives it that weight that ordinarily it wouldn't have. And so through our programming, we're able to kind of have these conversations, and community members are able to feel, like I said, that sense of ownership that they ordinarily wouldn't feel, and when we come back and bring people with them and show them kind of what they've seen and what's there and what's possible in these museum spaces.
And you all are not doing this on a top-down basis. Could you talk about, and anybody should just jump in, can you talk about how you collaborate with the local museums, local people in local communities, and even people who are not, as you said, are not yet engaged? But how do you grant them a voice in terms of what is being done curatorially to create exhibitions that are a little bit out of the box, that do engage these new audiences? Could you just talk a little bit about that partnership?
We think about it from everything from the interpretation of the object, of ensuring that we include translations when possible, and not just traditional sort of English, Spanish translations, but also identifying additional translations that make sense for the work, or maybe address a community that are coming into the museum or not coming into the museum, and ensuring that they are able to engage directly. It also includes with the type of programs that get associated with the work, that it may be a piece that we bring student poets in to create pieces that engage with that. And so it's multiple points of access of production, not just artworks themselves. And then also the way that we define art at Art Bridges is very broad. We talk about an inclusive concept of American art that includes works that previously would have maybe been placed in a craft category, or maybe left out of a traditional museum's interpretation of what American art is. But instead, we don't define it by chronology. We don't define it by nationality. We don't define it by gender or how an artist identifies. It's really about the work itself, what that work is accomplishing, and talking about an American experience, and then what communities can do to engage with that through their own sort of recognized art forms, whether it be visual or performance or, production.
I think that's a fabulous point that Ashley made, Anne and Brittany. In certain cultures, there is this sort of hierarchy within the art museum world that painted two-dimensional works are more fine than three-dimensional works, that are more fine than textiles and so on. But in certain cultures, those art forms go along not, two-dimensional, oil paintings, right? They're different art forms. And then Ashley also made the point that in certain cultures, you have the art is not segmented into visual or oral or performance or storytelling, right? It's all of a piece. So in a sense, the way we have traditionally presented art already tilts this. And what Ashley's saying, forgive me if I'm mischaracterizing here, Ashley. What you're saying is that the Art Bridges approach is really art-centric, people-centric, and it's not. And you haven't created a narrow definition of what that actually means, right? You're kind of inventing it with each community as you provide your services.
Absolutely. I mean, art is the foundation, and that's what we sort of lead from, but it's really everything that's built from that foundation that creates the strength of Art Bridges, and I think leads to the long-term impacts that we're seeing in communities.
And one thing that I love about Art Bridges, one of the many things, is that this work is continually building and growing and changing over time. Multiple partners are borrowing the same artworks. They're on the same trolley exhibition kind of schedule. And so there's an opportunity each time to learn from the previous venue and to add to, what the next site wants to do, or take the lessons learned and kind of iterate on that and make something better. And I just don't think that opportunity exists all the time, without, the ability of Art Bridges, kind of that members holding that knowledge and being able to share it with our partners through our conversations, but also through our website, through our Idea Center, specifically for programming, where we can highlight all of the amazing work that partners are doing and the programs that they're doing to engage communities and the impact that those are having, so that people can be inspired to maybe try it out at their own museum or ask their local museum to maybe put a program like that on.
It's so fabulous. It also strikes me, Anne, that the way you're going about this, and this has been from the very beginning when we were working with Alice way, I don't know, 5 years ago, that it seems like we're finessing the arguments that are unproductive, right? By being so expansive, by being so inclusive, by basically respecting each community at where they stand, and by having this idea of access for all, that's what you focus on. You don't focus on the unproductive stuff of who gets to define what American art is. It's basically everybody. Everybody gets to define what American art is. Every viewer, every artist, every institution, every community, right, Anne?
Yeah, no, I think we're basically trying to democratize access and the interpretation of those works of art and place as much emphasis on the viewer as the object. And I think that was, foundational for Crystal Bridges as well. And this kind of goes back to the point too around, what even qualifies as an object being worthy of included in a museum. And we have a much more expansive definition of that. Well, if you look at how Crystal Bridges was founded, Alice thought, maybe not everybody can see themselves in an art museum, but in this part of the country, everybody can see themselves in nature. And so she placed the museum within nature. And so that's sort of the gateway, right? And so I think we try to create as many gateways as possible for museums to be able to meet their communities where they are. One of the fundamental things is financial barriers. So we do have a program that helps reduce the, admissions cost. But even beyond that, for free museums that are already free, they're able to use those funds to market to new audiences, program for new audiences. So, anything that we can do, again, to place as much emphasis on the visitor as possible.
And it's a way to bring the country together. And goodness knows, we need that. We need that kind of energy. We need that kind of engagement. We need that kind of dialogue. It's great to be able to stand next to somebody who you don't know, who is taller, shorter, differently oriented or whatever, has a different background, and be able to look at a work and say, what do you think? I mean, it's not nice. Isn't that nice that you have that kind of engagement? And that's really what you're talking about. You're talking about being able to experience this together. So I'd like to thank you all for helping us to understand the work of Art Bridges. Anne Kraybill, CEO, Brittany Vernon, Director of Engagement Awards and Impact, and Ashley Holland, Curator and Director of Curatorial Initiatives. It is just great to benefit from your knowledge and from the knowledge and the work of Art Bridges. And thank you so much for your insights. It's just been a fabulous discussion.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.